Hi there. Thanks everybody for joining today on this M&A series of webinars that we're doing and we have been doing for a while. Today we're talking about working capital and how it works its way into M&A deals. And I guess I would start off by saying that, working capital is one of the probably least understood areas of an M&A deal at the lower levels in the lower middle market type deals. I would say very lower middle market. In the even going down to the Main Street deals, so the $1 to $5 million range. And in a lot of cases, maybe even working capital doesn't exist in there. Not that the company doesn't have working capital, but it may not be something that is involved in that transaction. So we're going to talk about all that. We're going to talk about how working capital works within a deal, when it may not be involved, when it might be involved, and focus on just how we can how we typically see this pop up in any given deal. So that's going to be the goal today. My name is Trevor Crow. You're going to see that my screen says Stan Doida. This was originally supposed to be presented by my partner Stan. He had an issue come up, so I'm standing in for him to present today. So even though it says Stan, this is Trevor, and we're gonna get right into it. So first off, just quickly about this is me, Doida Crow Legal. I'm a co-founder of the firm. We help entrepreneurs grow, buy, and sell businesses. That's our goal. That's what we do. We really focus on transactions in the one to I would say $20 million range on the buy side, and $5 to $100 million in the sell side. And so we've done deals all across that range there. I would say most of our deals though fall into that $1 to $50 million range, if we're talking about buy and sell side. And those are the transactions we look at, and we kind of consider that the lower middle market, even though I think down below 3 million and below, it's a little different. It's more of Main Street type deals. So anyway, that's us, and that's kind of the context that I'm going to be speaking about, and where my experience is. And so I'm happy to answer questions along the way. So if there's something pops up, please let me know. I will do my best to answer questions along the way as I see them come up. And so I have a couple screens working here, so I'm going to be making sure I can from time to time check out and see if there's any. Oh, sorry, I gotta click this thing off. See if there's any questions that come up along the way. It looks like I have one chat already. Um, oh, that's a non-question. So anyway, let's get into it. Working capital introduction here. So in its simplest form, working capital is really current assets minus current liabilities. That's the accountant's definition, right? That's what they'll think about. It's current assets minus current liabilities. But it's typically never current assets minus current liabilities in an M&A transaction. It's a specifically defined term in the purchase agreement, it's going to vary from all current assets minus current liabilities, and it's an important part of many M&A deals. And really, the way I want to kind of describe it to you guys is to think about it as it's really just a function of purchase price. So when you go to if you're on the buy side and you're putting out a LOI, is your purchase price considered that you're gaining working capital as well? So theoretically, at least, you could say, I'm not taking on any working capital, but then I might lower my purchase price. So it's really with the purchase price that you're putting out there, are you considering that purchase price in the context of taking on working capital as well, or receiving working capital as part of the business you're buying? Or are you considering, hey, I'm just buying the assets of the deal and I'm going to fund the working capital, and so that's how I came up with my purchase price? So it's really a function of purchase price, and I think it really depends on what size of the deal you're on, for how it may, whether it comes up or not. And so the purpose of working capital is to reflect the company's short-term liquidity, and make sure that you're getting it. If it's part of the deal, then you want to make sure you're getting that working capital, and that just allows you to operate the business without injecting more capital at the time. So if your purchase price is based on this company as a going concern, meaning that you're not injecting any more money other than what that purchase price is, then working capital should be included in the deal. And that would mean that you could buy this business with the purchase price, and then you would continue to operate without injecting more capital because you have current assets coming in that exceed your current liabilities. And so that's really the purpose. Every company is going to have working capital in some form. That's just the way that companies operate. You're going to have a cash cycle. And so the working capital is really, how do I get through that cash cycle? And so, as an example, for a law firm, our law firm, we do work, we pay rent, we pay salaries, we pay things along the way in any given month, and we're doing work for clients. And then at the end of the month, we would send an invoice, and that invoice, will get paid in 30 to 40 days, is a typical cycle for us to get cash in. But we have to had some cash in the meantime to pay all the expenses that we have, right? And so how do you get through that cash cycle is really what the working capital comes down to. So that's working capital. How do you calculate it? As I mentioned, current assets minus current liabilities is the technical accountant definition. And as I mentioned as well, that's not really what is used in an M&A transaction. Oftentimes it's, we may say it's current assets minus current liabilities, but we specifically define what current assets are for purposes of working capital. And we specifically define what is current liabilities for purposes of calculating working capital as well. And so typical components are going to be cash, receivables, inventory, payables, accrued expense, and accrued expenses. So those are all parts of working capital. On the current asset side, oftentimes cash is excluded from the definition in an M&A transaction. Although, again, an accounting definition would include cash, we're going to say this deal is on a cash-free, debt-free basis, and working capital is going to include things like accounts receivable, current assets for working capital are going to include accounts receivable, inventory, and and things like that. So whatever else might fit in there, depending on the industry or the type of business, but it's really oftentimes it's accounts receivable and inventory. Current liabilities, are typically accounts payable, accrued expenses, and prepaid expenses. Those are actually liabilities. So if somebody has prepaid for work that hasn't been done, then that's a liability on the balance sheet and for purposes of working capital. And so, in general, we are typically advising clients in LOIs to get all the major deal terms in there, right? So we want to get as many major deal terms into an LOI as we can to make sure that there's no issues with that later, so that we don't end up finding out that this was a major deal term later in the process after we've done due diligence and a lot of other things. People have spent time and money, and then we don't have a deal because there was a major deal term that wasn't agreed to. I would say the one exception to that is working capital, oftentimes. And there's more nuance to that. Obviously, there's some reasons why you might have a more general LOI than a very specific LOI. But just painting a broad brush here, we like to get the major terms taken care of in an LOI, and working capital is one of those exceptions because oftentimes you don't have enough information, at least on the buy side, to make to do an estimate or to come up with a working capital target. Oftentimes there's a working capital target or a PEG that sometimes people call it, and sometimes you don't have enough information for that as a buyer coming in, and so you would just have some terms in there that say that the purchase price includes normalized working capital based on the 12-month average or something like that, historical averages for the company or some industry benchmark you might have. And so you would just have that general language in a LOI, and then you would have to determine what that PEG is and negotiate it. Obviously, the seller would have to agree to it, and the buyer would have to agree to it in the purchase agreement. So being that is really just a purchase price adjustment, I think it is a major term of the deal. It's one of those ones that usually isn't negotiated up front. It's something that's put in generally in an LOI, and we have to figure it out later. From our firm standpoint, the lawyers aren't the ones figuring out what that PEG should be. That's typically your accountants or other, financial advisors that are looking at the financials and determining, all right, this is what the peg should be. This is what the working capital target should be for this M&A deal, so that when you pay this purchase price, you don't have to inject more cash. Um, all right. So that's working capital calculation. So this really, and I've kind of hit on a lot of these points, but the purpose of it is to just ensure that there's business continuity, that you're buying this business as a going concern. And again, if that was how you calculated your purchase price, then you're going to be able, then that's what you need. You need to be able to have that working capital so that you can come in and operate the business without injecting more cash, and really protects the buyers on establishing a baseline for operation and funding for moving forward and operating the business. And so, just I'll do a little tangent here now because I think it's appropriate to talk about the differences in when you see this. In a 3 million and below deal, if the enterprise value is 3 million and below, or if the multiple is low, you're not paying a high multiple. And that's common, right? In those deals that are 3 million and below, oftentimes those you're looking at a, two times multiple, 2.5, 3.5, 4, 3.5 probably top on those multiples. That can vary by industry, but in general, if you're paying those multiples and the purchase price is 3 million and below, oftentimes that deal and a lot of times the broker involved in that deal is not expecting LOIs to come with a working capital adjustment or a working capital target. They're saying we're selling this business on a cash-free, debt-free basis. Oftentimes it's some multiple of SDE, seller discretionary earnings, and then inventory is dealt with separately. So we're saying, hey, you're going to pay this price for the assets of the company other than inventory, and then whatever the inventory levels are is what you're going to pay extra for that. Or we come up with some level of inventory that it's going to be there, because inventory is always a tough one in those deals because it fluctuates, right? So you don't want to encourage a seller to just not buy more inventory and reduce it down to zero, and then you come into the business and have to just buy inventory right away, or not be able to fulfill customers' demands or purchase orders because you don't have any inventory. And so you got to deal with inventory, and oftentimes it's dealt with separately. So, in those real Main Street deals, that's what a lot of times the sellers are expecting. Cash-free, debt-free deal. You're buying the assets at some multiple of SDE, and you're going to get and the inventory might be treated separately as a separate price, depending on whatever that inventory is. For SBA deals, that also adds some issues to this. And, SBA deals are typically 7A loan. You're topped out at that 5 million. So these 5 million and under deals are, you got to get, if there is going to be working capital included, it's a tougher situation because you can't have an adjustment of that purchase price up. You can, and we've done plenty of deals with SBA loans that have working capital, but we have to structure it in a way where if we don't hit the target, if the seller sells the business and the target is not met, then we can reduce the seller note. And the SBA is fine with reducing seller notes, but they're not fine with it going up. And so then if the working capital peg is exceeded, so they transfer the business and there is more accounts receivable, then there is current assets, and we exceed the peg or the target, as it may be referred to, then what we have to do is just say that some of that accounts receivable becomes an excluded asset. So as that money comes in, it just gets paid out to the seller, and it was an excluded asset from the beginning. And so that's oftentimes how we structure that. But again, I would say that it's less common in those really Main Street deals. But it's starting to creep in there. I was just talking with some brokers last night, actually at an event, and they were talking about how, we're seeing more and more of offers come in with working capital provisions and working capital adjustments in LOIs for these very, lower middle market deals, or even Main Street deals, the 3 million and under type deals. Alternatively, when you have deals that are dealing with multiples off of, that are five and above, uh, and those deals are usually based off some multiple of EBITDA, and they're 5 million and over, you almost always see a working capital. Almost always, there's going to be in those type transactions, the buyer has calculated the purchase price off a multiple of EBITDA and is buying the business as a going concern and is anticipating getting normalized working capital as part of the transaction. So that's very typical, and I think it's almost in every deal that I see that are above 5 million or that have some multiple that's very high, which makes sense. And I think if I'm a seller and I am getting that high multiple, then I'm not as worried about the leaving the working capital in the business. That makes sense to me. If I'm selling for, 2 times SDE, then, that seller probably doesn't want a working capital adjustment as well. So that's that. Let's see here. All right. So again, I kind of mentioned this already, but establishing that working capital peg is difficult, and it usually takes more due diligence than what you receive as a buyer on just with the preliminary financials that you get before you have to submit an LOI that gets signed. The typical process is that you get some high level information. Usually you sign an NDA, get some high level information, and then you submit an LOI, and if that gets signed, then you get access to a lot more due diligence. And so that's a very typical route. And usually it takes that additional due diligence to actually come up with a working capital peg or a working capital target, because it's going to be based on historical financials, and you might want to have a Q of E done before, which is another thing that has kind of crept into the lower size deals, seeing more Q of E and even these 3 million, 2 million type deals. Used to not see that. Now we're seeing a lot more of it. Which I think is fine and good. It's good to get those and to make sure that you're confirming the financials. But usually you need that sort of analysis before you can come up with that working capital peg, and that's pretty typical. And then there's an adjustment mechanism, and there's a couple ways to do this. Right? You can have a two-step process where you have this working capital peg that's negotiated and put into the purchase agreement, and then at closing, there's an estimated working capital statement, or a closing statement. And so the seller will prepare a closing statement that says, hey, this is our estimated working capital that we think we're leaving in the business as part of this, which includes the definition of however it's calculated, whether that's just accounts receivable plus inventory. So they're going to say, hey, this is what we think the accounts receivable are and the inventory at closing, and here's our estimated closing statement that says, we either hit the target exactly, we're above it or below it. And then there's a price adjustment at closing. So, if the seller's estimated closing statement says that they've delivered the business with an amount that exceeds the target, then the purchase price is increased by that amount of that excess. And if it is a amount that's below the working capital target or peg, then the purchase price is decreased, and that's what's changed at closing. And then always there's a true up for that. So the true up is usually 90 days later, 60 to 90 days later, once the buyer can come in and actually look at the balance sheet and operate and determine. And then that buyer submits within 90 days, typically is a good term. Sometimes it's less, 30, 60, but usually 90. And then they submit their closing statement and say, all right, this is what we calculate as the closing statement as far as working capital is concerned, that we actually received this much inventory and this much accounts receivable. And if there's any fluctuations there, then there's a true up. So if the seller's initial estimated closing statement is off, then we true it up. And then there's usually a dispute resolution process in there in case there is a dispute on who actually calculated it correctly. That's the two-step process. The one-step process would be that there is no adjustment at the actual closing. We just, close, and then there's the true up later. So the purchase price stays the same, and we assume that the target was hit right on, and then there's adjustment later, 90 days later, that the buyer submits a closing statement. So those are the ways that can be adjusted. Let's see here. All right. So post-closing reconciliation process. This is, again, typically 30 to 90 days, as I mentioned. Oftentimes, I guess, on that reconciliation process, I would say if there's discrepancies, since I've already kind of talked about this, the only other thing I would add is that it's usually done in the dispute resolution process where there's an accountant appointed to do this. Rather than having to go, to court or anything like that, they just appoint an accountant or an accounting firm that's an independent firm that both parties agree to and say that they will take a look at it and they're gonna adjust and determine the working capital, what is correct based on the financial statements that they have. Both the closing financial statements that the seller prepared and the post-closing statement that the buyer prepares, and they're going to look at it and then determine who is right or what the actual working capital is. So that's typically how that resolution process goes, so that the dispute can be handled quickly and it can be handled without going to court. So that's a typical reconciliation process and dispute resolution process. Let's see. All right. Common pitfalls. So common pitfalls and best practices. I would say failing to clearly define working capital components and target levels can lead to disputes. So having these sort of things well defined in the purchase agreement is really important to make sure we know exactly how it works. Oftentimes, I even ask the sellers and buyers to agree on some methodology and an example working capital calculation, so we know exactly what's coming off those financials, what line items are coming off to calculate working capital, and so we have a specific methodology that we can point to that's attached as an exhibit to the purchase agreement. I think that's a good way to go because it makes sure that everybody's on the same page on how we're calculating this, and so that's important. Not accounting for seasonal trends is also an issue. You have to look at the whole. If you only looked at the past 2 months, but seasonally there's a big discrepancy in what working capital is needed. I think that's something that needs to be looked at. So that's why oftentimes it's done on a trailing 12-month historical average, so that it would cover any seasonality issues that come up. I would say, best practices are, the flip side of some of these. Define working capital terms and calculation methods in that purchase agreement and make sure they're defined very well. And then, monitor and manage the working capital regularly post-closing to address any deviations. So, just because the closing statement comes up 90 days later, having a 30-day check-in or 60-day check-in to monitor that, I think is important to make sure that there's no issues along the way and can help from there being just a big issue down at the end, or at the end of 90 days that there's a big dispute about. A couple of other things I think that are important to mention here is that there's there's such thing as negative working capital. So we've been on deals where on the sell side where the seller takes all payments in advance, like a technology company. It was a SaaS company in our case. And they would collect all their revenue in advance. So, for a customer coming in, they pay on January 1 for the right to use that software for the whole month of January. So they're all getting paid in advance. And so, if the customers are paying in advance, then that's really a prepaid item. So prepaid revenue is really a liability. A prepaid expense alternatively is a asset, a current asset. And so, that there's some issues there to think about. If you're getting payments early as a seller, you need to be aware of the fact that you may have negative working capital, and then that working capital target, should reflect that, and because maybe that should be a negative working capital. That buyer who comes in and buys on January 1, if that seller gets to take all that money, then they have to, support the software for that whole month, and they're not getting any revenue for it because that's the month that those people paid for. So they got paid in advance. So definitely some issues that can come up with one, both prepaid expenses that become assets, current assets, and prepaid revenue, or oftentimes called deferred revenue, which is really a liability on the balance sheet, and so that makes it tough too. But quickly, I will add that if you are looking at one of those lower, more Main Street type deals that doesn't include working capital, then the issue oftentimes that is addressed instead of working capital is work in progress, right? So you have, if the deal is structured in a way where it's cash free, debt free, and it's some multiple of SDE, and then you pay for inventory separately, or there's a target inventory level that's included, and you just have this one set purchase price. That's how a lot of Main Street deals are. The issue is that what about work in progress, and those prepayments? So as I mentioned, you still want to address that sort of things even in those Main Street deals, because as an example, if it was a HVAC company, they may have 4 projects in the works at the closing date, and those projects may have had deposits that were paid early. And if it's cash free, debt free, the seller's walking away with those deposits. But then you may still, as the buyer, may have a lot of the work to do on that project still, because at closing there's 5 more days of work that you're sending people out. And if they got paid majority of it in the deposit, then we have to work that out. So oftentimes the agreement will have some work in progress adjustment that will have to be dealt with, especially on those lower Main Street deals that don't have working capital. So that's something to think about. And I would say another one, which isn't working capital related, but is warranty work. That's often addressed too, and that's a separate thing from working capital, but it's important because in those same type deals, the seller may have provided a bunch of work, and done and finished work and gotten paid for it, but they've provided a warranty on it that says, if something comes up in the next 6 months or 60 days or whatever, then we'll come fix it. And so then that now becomes, if that project was occurred pre-closing and seller's taking all accounts receivable and all cash, then you're stepping into that as a buyer and would have to complete that work, post-closing. And so that warranty work also is something that gets addressed. But anyway, that is our time. Let me see if I have any questions here. I don't have any questions so far. But that's working capital. As I mentioned, it's a fairly complex part of an M&A deal that is often not understood. But I do think it's once you get into it, it's a little simpler than maybe it sounds at first blush. And it's definitely it's not just if it's something that's part of your deal, you got to remember that it's a purchase price adjustment, and that's whether you're a buyer or a seller. It's whether you include working capital or not in deal, again, will depend on size and the multiple and a number of things, and how what you need to put out there to win the deal. But it's definitely a function of purchase price. So that's the way to think about it. And so yeah, if you're buying or selling a business and you need any help or want to talk about it, please give us a call. We do a lot of this type work and love working with ETA search funders that are looking to buy businesses. We love working with sellers, especially founder-led sellers who have built businesses and are selling, whether that's to a private equity group or to an ETA buyer, whoever it is. That's what we do. And so happy to talk anytime. All my contact information is here. And let me just check one more last time for questions here. Yep, got one. All right, let's see here. Is cash usually included in working capital calculation for deals? I would say no. Cash is usually excluded. So usually in the purchase agreement, we don't use cash as part of the working capital calculation. The only time that I would say we include cash is, there might be other situations. So like there might be a situation where the company really needs cash right away and they have a long accounts receivable cycle. And depending on when the closing date happens, we may say that working capital includes some minimum amount of cash. So if the target was $100,000 of working capital, we may say that 25,000 has to be in cash and 75 has to be would be in other assets, like accounts receivable and things like that. So there could be situations like that. The other situation where I see cash included is if there is those prepayments. So if there's deferred revenue. So if the company has taken on a lot of revenue for projects that they haven't provided the service for or the product for, that's deferred revenue, then we may say you have to leave all that in the business because we're providing the service moving forward. So if you got paid up front for either a project you're going to provide services for, or you got paid up front for software access that the customers are going to have, or whatever it is. If you got deferred revenue, then that we may say that stays in the company. Sometimes that's defined as restricted cash, and then you might say that we're going to keep the restricted cash in the purchase agreement. So the definition doesn't really matter, but that might be a situation where the cash would actually be included in the working capital. All right, let's see. Do you have a reference for how to calculate the PEG? Yeah, I mean, send me an email. My email is right here. I can send you. I think might need a few more details, but yeah, if you have an accountant CPA that you're working with, that might be a good person. If you're working with a QAV provider, that might be a good person. Otherwise, it's somebody who can read financials and tell you, what is the normalized working capital. That's the type of person you need. But send me an email, and with a little more context, I'm sure I can point you in the right direction to somebody that can help you with a referral or a reference. So, all right. That is it. I appreciate everybody attending, and I don't see any other questions, so we're going to go ahead and we'll end the webinar and appreciate all your time. Thanks.